I'm a medical epidemiologist. That means I'm a physician, but instead of treating individual patients, I focus on patterns of disease in whole communities. My particular expertise is infectious diseases in low-income countries, so it might seem a little odd that I'm on a panel talking about climate solutions. But it turns out that the pollution that affects the climate, much of it also affects human health. For the 8 years before I joined Stanford, I was living in Bangladesh. If you look on a map, Bangladesh looks like a small country. And in fact, it is only the size of the state of Iowa, but it has a population equivalent to half of the US. Because it's a low-lying delta of the Ganges River, it is one of the countries most affected by rising sea levels. What is less commonly known is it's also a country with particularly bad air pollution, amongst the worst in the world. Each winter, a brown cloud forms over the top of Bangladesh. As a physician studying pneumonia, the leading cause of death among children globally, I became particularly concerned about the impact of this air pollution on the health of the people living in Bangladesh. So as I started to think more and more and work and consider this air pollution, it took me to the brick fields outside of Dhaka. And if you go outside of any city in South Asia, you'll see similar brick fields. And that's because these dynamic economies are powered by buildings that are being built out of bricks. This is the grist of these dynamic economies. But these brick fields also generate 40% of the particulate matter in Dhaka, the capital city, during the wintertime. And modeling suggests that this air pollution results in 5,000 deaths each year in Dhaka. And it's not just a local health problem. If you think about the brick kilns across all of South Asia, they generate as much impact on the climate as the entire US passenger car fleet. When I was discussing this situation with the chairman of the Bangladesh Brick Manufacturer Owners Association, he said to me, "Steve, we know we have problems. What we need is help with solutions." And then he paused for a while and he said, "We were hoping that Stanford could help." Now, if you want to engage in complex public health problems, you need to understand the perspectives of stakeholders. You need to work with stakeholders over the long term. So we need to understand the perspective of the people who are making the bricks, of the people who are buying the bricks, and the people who are responsible for regulating brick kilns. So we conducted in-depth anthropologic study to understand the system of incentives that was generating a system whereby we were making bricks with such highly polluting kilns. And what we learned is that these type of brick kilns offer a compelling business model. The inexpensive bricks dominate the market. And the kiln owners earn 80% return on investment in a single year. And since Bangladesh is a weak state, the regulators have very little capacity to enforce. At the request of stakeholders, we're also generating evidence that links the emissions from brick kilns to the health of the community. Our stakeholders are trying to generate information for action because they find that Bangladeshi decision makers are more interested in data that talks about the number of deaths, the 5,000 deaths in their city, rather than talking about something more abstract like global climate change. So as we've considered this network of incentives, we have begun thinking about incentive-compatible interventions. So this would be an intervention that stakeholders are interested to take up, and so that we don't need the government to enforce a regulation. So this is a picture of a natural draft chimney kiln. The tall chimney so increases the updraft that the kiln no longer needs a motor and a fan to drive air through. In fact, there's so much air flowing through that when this is combined with a particular layout of the kiln, of the bricks, in a zigzag pattern, you actually improve combustion efficiency so much that this kiln generates 25%, consumes 25% less coal per brick and generates 85% less black carbon. And the savings on the coal in the first year pay for the upgrade. So this is an intervention that is good for climate, that is good for health, and is also good business. And so these type of efficiency improvements, these incentive-compatible interventions, we're working on a suite of these. And it's not just the technology, because we're trying to drive system uptake. And one of the barriers to system uptake is just basic information. People who want to improve brick manufacturing in Bangladesh don't have basic information about where the kilns are, what their design is, whether they're operating or not. The government has some information, but the information is inaccurate, not publicly available. So we turned to Stanford undergraduates who started as part of a course to use satellite imagery from Bangladesh and develop a machine learning algorithm to look at images that had kilns and images that did not, and create an algorithm that could predict whether there was a new kiln in a new image, and then extract the pixels that triggered that identification, and then use that to generate a GPS coordinate. Now, this is really clever, cutting-edge computer science. But what excites me is these students are turning satellite data into information that our stakeholders can use to improve brick manufacturing in Bangladesh. And so we're now tying some of this image data to recommendations in Bengali for kiln owners of steps they can take to save coal. I'm very gratified by the collaboration between Stanford and my colleagues in Bangladesh. But I realize that the world doesn't hear very much about these types of efforts. Our news media seems to be a barrage, a daily barrage of bad news that has an underlying disempowering narrative. The narrative suggests that climate change is inexorable, that the strong economic and political forces driving it will overwhelm what anyone can do. I want to offer an alternative narrative. Climate change is a human-generated problem. Humans can stop it. I joined Stanford 7 years ago because of Stanford's commitment to work with stakeholders to go into the world and work on hard problems, the types of problems that have surrounded me when I was in Bangladesh. I continue to be excited to come to Stanford every day because I engage with students who bring their enthusiasm, their interest, and their new perspectives to these problems. I can tell you from personal experience that Stanford students love to work on solutions. Now, our work on brick kilns is still incomplete. Because we're engaged in a hard problem in the world, we have made a lot of mistakes. But because we've embraced the Stanford ethos, we're also learning from each of these mistakes. I'm sure we will make mistakes in the future, but have no doubt we are making progress.